Greetings and salutations. This is Imperator Vespasian and his trusty sidekick.
Hello.
We have in front of you two of our T28s.
Yes.
T28. These are T28s for T28Cs from the for our Finnish army. Obviously, Finland didn't build T28s. They didn't build anything actually. They just stole it, borrowed it, or bought it. Generally, these particular tanks were used by the Finnish army. They quite liked them. They captured them from the Russians. The Russians spent a huge amount of time driving all the way up to Finland across really rough terrain, so when they arrived they tended to break down. So it was quite easy capturing the tanks because a lot of them just broke down. So that turned out fine for the Finns, didn't it?
Yeah.
The Finns captured them and used them. They were generally in pretty good condition when they were captured. The actual T28s that they captured. They just needed a little bit of work to the engines, maybe a new bit of track fitting, which you can do quite easily when you've got lots of burnt out T28s around because they've all got bits you can steal off. So the Finns used them as infantry support tanks, and which is what they were designed for, but they also used them as fixed point defence. So they would put them in a hull down position, put snow up to here, and use them as static pillboxes, which could at any point be reversed out of their dugout and moved to somewhere else. So the Finns were quite useful at using them. Later on, Finland had already created two tank battalions, platoons actually, and they slowly began to upgrade to heavier tanks as they captured tanks. So then they created more units with tanks in. So they ended up with two heavy tank platoons and a number of light tank platoons, which were used by I suppose there would be the light infantry units would use them to support. Yeah, it's a bit complicated with the Finnish army because it was a very light army. It didn't have sort of dedicated mechanised troops or anything. So the two tank units, they started off with captured T28, T28s, and
from the Russian.
Captured from the Russians. Then, as the war went on, they captured a KV, a single KV, and they put that in a T28 unit. Then they captured another T26 and then they put that in the unit. And what they did was, every time they captured a heavy tank, they would flip a coin as to which unit it would go to.
The Finns, man.
Yeah, the Finns. This is the point. Had it been, say, any other army on Earth, they would have said, right, we need all the same types of tank in the same unit, because then keeping spare parts and supplies, you have a truck following these things around, you can have all the same set of spare parts that will fit all the tanks in the unit. So if you have a unit of KVs and a platoon of KVs and a platoon of T28s, the trucks following these guys around are going to be able to resupply these tanks, so they'll have all the spare parts for them. The Finns didn't do that. The Finns literally flipped a coin to see who would get the tank. So you had mixed units of KVs and T28s. Now, if you know anything about the KV was about the most modern, toughest, awesome tank you could possibly get on the Eastern Front at the time. And they were mixing them in with these things here built in the 1930s. These tired old designs which the Russians had come up with, infantry support tanks. Yeah. The Finns did try to get hold of some A9s from the British, and the troops who trained to use A9s ended up using the T28s because they'd actually trained on British tanks. Because the British A9 is actually the same layout as the T26, because it has two twin turrets and this is how it's mounted on this, but the British tank had an anti-tank gun. So it wasn't a far stretch for the Finns. They already had troops who had actually learnt to drive these things, and they just replaced them with Russian stuff because they couldn't get hold of the British stuff.
Yeah.
During peacetime, people would be sent from different countries around the world to practice on other people's tanks. Well, not all around the world, but Germany sent a lot of tank crews, panzer crews, to Russia to learn to use tanks. And a lot of the early war German army, a lot of the tank crews would actually have trained in Russia because Germany wasn't allowed to have tanks, and so they trained in Russia because they had this treaty. Germany would buy lots of raw materials from Russia, therefore keeping up the Russian economy, and they would be able to practice their tank warfare. Which didn't really work out well for the Russians because those exact tactics ended up being used on the Russians. So kind of stabbed themselves in the foot there. Yeah. Any questions?
How did the Finns use them? Because they only had single roads and trees.
Oh, they didn't try to use them as fully fledged tank units. By the end of the Finnish war, they'd actually withdrawn the heavy tanks that they'd captured and were using them as reserve. So what you do is you instead of having these, at first they would have them on the front line covered in snow and they'd stack logs up here, but the back would be free, and I'll just move that, so it would be in a dugout, so all you could see was that bit, and the machine guns could fire away and the big howitzer could blow the enemy to pieces. But then bear in mind you can't use this tank against other tanks.
Why?
It's only fitted with a howitzer. So unless you're fighting T26s, which the Russians had a lot of. Sorry, not T26s. Yeah, T26s. Yeah, that's the main Russian tank, wasn't it? So if you fight T26s, then you could probably do damage to them. But if the Russians are deploying other T28s and the T35, which was the huge 5-turreted battle tank, these things couldn't damage them. Neither could the Finnish anti-tank guns, and so the Finns were very happy to capture the KVs, but not at this point. So as the war continued, they withdrew all their heavy tanks, or both platoons, and they kept them in a rear area, and so at any point the Russians would break through the Finnish lines, the Finns could send in this small group of heavy tanks, which would, well, the Russians had nothing that could go up against them, because of the Russians would have penetrated the Finnish line, the Russian infantry, and then they'd be facing these things which are designed to kill infantry. So actually quite good tactics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting one. The paint scheme is the paint scheme I'm using on them. I've used the same paint scheme on all my tanks because they're all set in the same period, and it's a later war paint scheme. All the Russians tended to just whitewash their tanks. They just painted their tanks with whitewash to try and camouflage them. The Finns captured the Russian tanks with the whitewash, and they used to mix charcoal with paint, and they painted on these lines to enable them to camouflage them.
Smart.
Yeah, that's how they did it. They didn't actually use paint. They couldn't even afford paint, so they're Finns. That's what they do. They just invent stuff on the spot. Very clever people, the Finns. I also stuck a Finnish flag on the back for in case there's an aircraft flying over and spots some T28s and decides to drop bombs on them. That way, you don't drop bombs on your own tanks. Which is why tanks had flags on the back. That's why you put a flag on the back of a tank.
Especially if you're British and there's Americans nearby.
The British actually didn't put flags on the back of their tanks because we didn't have the flags to put on. We needed flags, we couldn't. Which is quite. The flags weren't taken with us, or they were kept at regimental headquarters. So you didn't have a flag to just grab hold of and stick on the back of a tank. The French did. The French had put flags on the back of their tanks. They were quite flag heavy. Every country put flags on their tanks, just not the British. Hence, our tanks tend to get blown up by our own aircraft. So
Yeah.
it's something that happens. See, it's a bit of a thing. If you put you can only really put flags on the back of your tanks if you have at least air parity. Because if you're the one that doesn't have air superiority and it's not your planes in the sky, you don't really want to advertise yourself to them. So usually the reason you put a flag on the back of your tank is if you are actually working in conjunction with aircraft. As in, you know the aircraft are assigned to your area. Hence you see loads of pictures of German tanks with the flag on the back of them. That's because they were working directly in conjunction with aircraft and they knew the aircraft would be over their heads all the time. So they had to make it easier to be spotted. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. Any more questions?
No, that's it.
No. Outro?
Alright, so if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and comment down below what you think of the T28s that are actually Russians.
Yeah.
That's it from me.
And everything from him. Goodbye.
See ya.